When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Good evening. Welcome to the Erudition Network, Black History Interactive. I want to welcome you all, even if you are one of those who probably will be watching this as a replay. We're a little bit later tonight. I had some things that were going on, but I wanted to make sure that I got an episode in this week for you all because last week being Easter, and we didn't do one because we wanted to enjoy Easter and let you all have your time with your family and your people and everything and get ready for that holy weekend. But we are here right now. If this is your first time here, understand something from the start. This is not a reaction channel. This is not a social media channel. And this is not a place where we repeat surface level history. This is the Erudition Network. This is where we break things down. We challenge what we have been taught, what has been revisioned and shared, and we rebuild, understanding that based on our history should be based on documented evidence, historical record, critical thinking, and most importantly, facts. And so what we try to do here is provide you all with information that is factual. I want you to be able to think. I want you to be able to ask questions, to think empirically. And I want you to challenge what it is that you hear and what it is that you see. In order to do that, you have to be willing to let go of all of the revision thoughts that you may have been taught. This is also an interactive. So even if you are here, you join us here live, or you're one of those who come on and you watch the program later, I want you to engage. So throughout tonight, you may hear me ask you questions about what it is that we're covering. I want you to put it in the chats. I want you to go on YouTube and put it in the remarks. I want you to go in and question what it is that we're talking about. We will always have sources and facts, but I want you to be able to challenge the ideas if you need to, because this is not just about listening, it's about understanding. And so we want you to do that. Tonight, the topic is one of something that most people think they already understand. When I talk to people about history, they tend to think that this particular topic is something that they have a good mind around, and they know they can actually break it down. But when you look at it, you realize very quickly that key pieces of what we have been taught in our history have been left out. Key things that are important to us have been left out. So we're going to talk about Black economic power. People say, why does it have to be Black economic power? But it's important to understand the history, not just where we are today, but where we came from, how it developed, and what happened to us over time. Because if we understand that, when we start talking about reparations, we start talking about why people are impoverished, you get a better understanding. In order to do that correctly, we have to start in a place that most discussions avoid entirely. And I'm going to surprise you. I'm not talking about slavery. We're not going to start with oppression. We're not going to start with struggle, right? We're going to start with structure. We're going to start with factual history, because if you begin the story at the point of a culture's destruction, right, then everything that comes after looks to them like it's their natural condition, and that was not the fact. That is not our natural condition. It never was. But if you begin a story where it actually starts, if you tell the history where we actually started from, you see something very different. You understand things differently. So before we get into policies, before we get into redlining, which people always talk about, before we get into reparations, before we get into modern economics, we have to establish a baseline truth. We have to establish something to be a fact. Black economic power did not begin in America. And I want you to understand that. It did not begin in poverty. We're not an impoverished culture of people. It began in an organized system. It began in a structured economies throughout Africa and international networks that existed long before the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were influencing people all over, even into Europe, through the Med, and everywhere. And so we have to start there. African economic power and systems are real. When we talk about Africa in historical context, most people have been conditioned to think in terms of absence. Most people have been conditioned to think that it didn't exist. Absence of organization, absence of wealth, absence of structured systems, absence of education. That perception is not supported by historical records, by historical fact. And what we actually see when we look at the actual history is coordination, regulation, and preparation that influenced global economic systems for centuries. Tonight, we're just going to take that different approach. We're going to go differently. I don't want to start with slavery, oppression. I don't want to start with what was done to us, because if we don't understand the structures of what is and what became before, we will always think of something in bondage. We will always focus on bondage. It didn't begin in America, and it did not begin in poverty. When we look at the West Africa in particular, we are not looking at scattered tribes without coordination. We are looking at empires. We are looking at controlled territory. We are looking at managed trade routes. We are looking at places where they enforced fair taxation, and they participated in global commerce that pushed through the Med, through upper Africa, into the Med, into Europe, that went east, and that touched on all cultures, those in the Indus Valley, those who are in the Asian Pacific of areas, everywhere. But if we just focus on just one area, we're gonna be wrong. I want to talk about the Mali Empire. I wrote about this in my book. The Mali Empire is one of the clearest examples of this. It is a history that cannot be denied. By the 14th century, Mali had positioned itself as a central recognized authority over trans-Saharan trade. They predominantly traded gold and salt, but those weren't their only commodities. They were the backbone of economic exchange across regions that connected West Africa, North Africa, and into parts of Europe and the Middle East. Their reputation was known as a wealthy, intelligent culture. If you don't believe me, you can go look at several historical analyses that include works, right, that break out West African history. And I will include some of those in our chats and in some of these things on our YouTube channels and our Facebook channels. But I wanted you to understand that Mali controlled a substantial position and portion of the known gold supply in the known world during that period. Some historians estimate that they had so much gold that it may have been as high as nearly half of the circulating gold that was recognized during that time. That's how wealthy Mali was. And if you understand what that means, that gold at that time was not symbolic. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't what you see in the European chapels and in the kingdoms. It was primary means of wealth storage and exchange. It was used to finance cultures. It was used to give wealth to cultures and to nations. So when one region controls that level of gold, it does not just have local influence. It has international. It has wide-ranging economic impact on the world. Maps were made that showed Musa at the bottom of it with near where Mali was. That's how important it was to European life. When Musa traveled, he became a legend. We talk about it even today. He is considered to be one of the richest people who has ever lived on this planet. Not the Rockefellers, not the people that you've been talking about, but when Musa traveled to Mecca in 1324, his caravan moved through Africa. It moved through Cairo. And during that passage, he distributed such a large amount of gold that it actually disrupted local economies. The 14th century historian Al-Umari, right, documented that the influx of gold that he was throwing out as he made his pilgrimage led to inflation that affected the region for decades. Decades. That's how much gold was there. It affected the ideas of people as far as Europe. Great educators like Ibn Khaldun also referenced the scale of wealth associated with Musa's rule. This is historical fact. We have evidence of this. This is not folklore. This is not myth. And I hear people on TikTok and different that the myth of Musa. No. This is a recorded economic disruption caused by the movement of African wealth throughout the entire region. We did not come from a bankrupt poor people, a bankrupt poor culture, a bankrupt poor background. But here's the thing. If we only focus on the gold, we miss something else important that a lot of historians and a lot of people miss. Wealth at that level does not sustain itself. It cannot sustain itself. It needs a system to grow it, to continue to allow it to affect people. It needs a functional system behind it. And this is where we get into the education, the knowledge, the structures. This brings places like Timbuktu into focus. Timbuktu was not simply a trading post. It was not something simply in some American song. It was a structured center of learning where you learn administration and commerce and history. The Sankor system, which is often referred to as a university, functioned as a network of scholars and instructors who trained individuals throughout Africa in law, in astronomy, in mathematics, in religion, in governance. These were people who understood how systems should work. They directly supported trade, contracts, legal contracts, and economic stability. We have manuscripts that are there that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, that are preserved and have been cataloged, that show written records of commercial agreements, legal rulings, financial transactions, to show you how the structure worked. These documents demonstrate the complexity of the economic life that was regulated, most importantly recorded, and then enforced and recognized from not only in Africa, but all throughout the known world. In other words, it wasn't just about gold. It wasn't just about trading. They were operating with understood frameworks of accountability, of law, and of commerce, and of finance. Now, if we shift further south, we also see how Mali affected other places. We can look at Zimbabwe, the great Zimbabwe. It presents a different but equally important model of how economy should work. Between the 11th and the 15th centuries, this city functioned as a major node in long-distance trade. It connected inland Africa to the Swahili coast. And from looking at all of the records, there we have the identification of merchants operating even across the Indian Ocean. That is major. That's not a people who came from nothing. That's not a people who didn't understand economics. It's not a people who didn't understand how systems were supposed to work. That comes from a knowledgeable, practical understanding that we're often not taught in our schools. And that's unfortunate, because what happens then is we get the social media education. We get the myth and folklore education. We get the lies that don't tell the truth, that sensationalize other than being factual. And very often, because so many of those, that misinformation and those untruths are out there, we have a negative look at our own cultural ancestry and background. And we see ourselves as a people who only beg and need, and that's a lie. Archaeological findings documented by researchers throughout the ages, right, talk about Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, Indian trade goods. These are not items that appear in isolation. They reflect how Africa was trading all the way through the East. They reflect sustained commercial relationships that required coordination, negotiation, and stability. And I wrote about them in my first history book, so that you can go through these cultures and understand. So again, we are not looking at disconnected societies. We're not looking at a dark continent of people who didn't understand. We are looking at regions integrated into global economic systems that still have relevance in the world today, who still, those artifacts and those ancient artifacts and that gold is still relevant today. Now, here's where the conversation usually stops with most people when they discuss this. People will acknowledge sometimes the trade. They definitely acknowledge the gold, and then they move on. But we do something a little deeper here, right? Because there's a deeper layer that made these systems durable. Economic life in many societies was tied to lineage. It was tied to land. It was meant to be continuous. It was meant to be passed on. Land was not always treated as an individual commodity. It was often connected to family lines, communal responsibility. Wealth was preserved through networks that extended beyond a single individual's life. Now, we see that in Western society, but we are often taught about it in African society. Skills, knowledge was passed intentionally. Knowledge wasn't random. It was taught. It was passed down. It was refined, and it was repeated across generations so that the economic participation of the family, of the culture, did not begin to fall away or zero out in time. So when we talk about wealth, we're not just talking about the gold and the currency. We're talking about systems. We're talking about family. We're talking about things that allow wealth to be created, protected, and transferred. That is the part that is rarely emphasized. That is the part that is rarely taught. That is the part that a lot of people start to fantasize about. But I'm telling you that this is factual. Because once you understand that, you have to confront a different reality about what happened, what actually took place during the transatlantic slave trade. People were not taken from empty environments and brought into a working structure. They were taken from structured environments and placed into a system where they could grow that existing structure and make it better so that it could operate. That is what happened. What is lost is not just about labor. It's not just about theft. What is lost is continuity. What is lost is knowledge. What is lost is the accumulation of knowledge of generations and hundreds of years. What is lost is the ability to transfer systems from one generation to the next without an interruption. And I want you to think about that for a moment. Rather you watching this later, rather you catch up later, I want you to think about what this means. Before tonight, how many of you have ever thought that African societies were part of a global trade network at the highest level? Oh, you may have known about the gold. You may have known about the centers of knowledge in Timbuktu. How many did you understand it's not just trade, but structured, documented economic systems? When you watch this, go in the comments and tell me if you knew. Don't lie. It's okay not to know. Because now you're being taught it, now you're learning. And if you weren't taught it, then ask yourself, what were you taught instead? That's why I don't want you to lie and ignore it. What were you taught instead of that? What was placed in front of you instead of that? Because once we establish that level of organization existed, once we can acknowledge that, we can no longer accept simple explanations of what we see today, of the wealth we see in Europe and in the West today. We have to start looking at harder questions. We have to start looking at harder issues. We have to understand what was built and what was interrupted, and what happens to a people when that type of interruption happens, and then it lasts for generations. What does that do to you? How does that affect you? We have to look at the destruction, the violence, the policy, and the systemic interruptions of Black wealth that we have seen throughout the decades, throughout the centuries. Because see, now that we've established that structured economic systems existed prior to slavery, and that wealth, knowledge, and continuity were already embedded within these systems, Now we have to move carefully into what came next. Because if this part is misunderstood, and it often is, everything that follows begins to sound like decline. Instead of what the historical record actually shows, which is repeated interruption. Repeated interruption. And we're going to make a distinction here because that distinction matters. Because decline suggests that we became weak and we just lost it. But interruption suggests that there is an interference and that it may have been hidden from us. It may have been pushed aside for us, but it's still there. When you begin to see outcomes across different places, across different decades, across different times, do you start to understand the mathematical, biological inheritance that you have to build from nothing, to grow from nothing? You start to see it across distance and time. You stop looking at it as, oh, we just failed. Everything was taken. You are no longer looking at coincidence. You're going to look at a pattern, and patterns is what I do as a polymath. I look at patterns is what I try to see in the history, because then patterns require an explanation. They require you to then go and try to find out why. When we look at the earlier 20th century, one of the clearest examples of interruption, but a continual pattern, right, is something that has become very well known today, but often isn't talked about in the way I'm going to talk about it tonight. That's destruction of Black Wall Street, the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. You see, even when we look at that event, it is commonly presented in economic loss. That's the way it's presented. And it was. Right? Greenwood is often described as a prosperous Black neighborhood, but that description doesn't fully explain truly what existed there. It doesn't go deep enough. This was not simply a place where individuals were doing well. This, again, is what we talked about earlier. This was a functioning economic system that empowered the wealth of not only Black people, but even the white people that were in the area. It provided an economic system that circulated. There were banks, there were medical practice, there were law offices, there were hotels, there were stores, there was transportation services. There were things there to grow wealth, and they were owned and operated within the Black community. That money entered, moved, and then it stayed long enough to multiply, to pay for the houses in the area, to pay for the clothing, and to make the people there more affluent. They just happened to be Black predominantly. And that is what we have to focus on, and it's not often focused on, because what that meant was economic strength. Y'all quiet tonight. If you with us, drop it in the line. If you're on Facebook and we don't see what you're putting in there, please join us on YouTube. I don't see anything happening in our chat. And I definitely want to hear from you. This is an interactive, and I know we're later, but I see people coming in and out. Please feel free, right, to drop your thoughts. Greenwood was a place that had an economic strength. And to show you how cruel, in less than 24 hours, much of that economic structure was destroyed. Buildings were burned. Businesses were looted. Residents were killed. Residents were displaced. It was horrible. But the deeper issue is what followed. Insurance claims were denied. Blacks couldn't go and get these places rebuilt through insurance claims. And often under riot clauses, there was little to, if any, and there was none, restitution. So what you have is not just the destruction, but the removal of the system and the ability to recover at the same level. And you have to think about that for a moment. If you build something where money is circulating within your community and it is destroyed quickly in a single event, and then you are told that you will not be compensated in any meaningful way, what does that do to your willingness to rebuild the same way? What does that do to your ideas? Because now it's not just rebuild, but then you have to trust the system that allowed the loss to happen in the first place. You have to look at a system that allowed that violence and that killing and that murderous contempt to go unaddressed. Think about that. So you have no choice but to rebuild on your own. And when you think about it and you answer it honestly in your own mind, why do you want to move forward? But they did. We often neglect the fact of looking back and understand that they rebuilt. They rebuilt after that. And then people tried to ignore what had happened. It may not have been as affluent as it was before, but they had the wherewithal to rebuild. Tulsa is not an isolated case. We know that. In 1923 in Rosewood, another Black community where land ownership and economic stability and a wealthy system was again destroyed under racial violence and burned down houses and businesses. And the survivors fled, leaving their property behind. Wealthy property. That land didn't simply disappear. It was taken. It was repurposed, stolen, and left without its legal original owners. But in all of those cases, what do we really see? The continuity of ownership was broken. It was hindered. Black advancement and wealthy advancement was hindered because people left and tried to go do what? Rebuild somewhere else. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to you all about the Wilmington coup of 1898 in North Carolina. After Black people post-Civil War had gone in and rebuilt parts of the Carolinas in the government, in business and everything. We see not only violence, but the removal of Black political leadership through an actual American coup. When political power was taken and removed, people stole wealth, they stole community, they stole growth. They stole all of that from those who had built it, those who understood it and came from a tradition and an ancestry of understanding systems, finance, and commerce. All of these, the Wilmington coup, Rosewood, Tulsa, all of these things are taught separately, but when viewed together, they reveal a pattern. A pattern. Whenever Black economic concentration and ownership began to flourish and to take hold, it was challenged. It was a threat. And under this country's understanding of racial dynamics, it became vulnerable to the disruption that we're talking about. And once disrupted, a lot of times it was rarely restored in full. People went back to rebuild because that's what our culture does. They went back to try to refashion, but that doesn't mean that it was as affluent as it was before, because new laws, new things, new situations were put in to try to keep that affluency down. This is interactive. So let me ask you something again. When you see the same outcome happen in different places over and over again, maybe under different conditions, maybe during different decades, at what point do we stop calling it a coincidence? At what point do we stop saying that, oh, because there are historians, white historians and white people and people who are even on TikTok to this day telling us, oh, it wasn't systemic. It wasn't, because it wasn't, is it 2 times? Is it 3 times? Or does this come at a point where you have to recognize that every time something was structured and business and economy was taking place, you ripped it apart? I want you to ask yourself that. I want you to answer that in the comments. I want you to really think about it. I'm going to get people in chat who are going to tell me, oh, you're just funneling hate. Absolutely not. Because that's an important question. That's an important question, because that question changes how you interpret everything else that followed. It changes how you look at everything that came before. Because alongside these visible acts of destruction, there is another layer that is often framed positively, but needs to be understood more fully, needs to be, examined more fully. And that is the great Black migration between early 1900s and then even all the way into the 1970s. Millions of Black Americans moved from rural South, where they own land, businesses, and all types of things, to urban centers in the North and the Midwest. This movement was often described as a search for opportunity. My ancestors, my family, my grandfather. I have a great-grandfather that was killed in the South, and his family migrated to Chicago. And that there are millions of people who have that story. People were seeking better wages, industrial jobs, and most importantly, they were seeking relief from the overt violence and murder that was permissive in the South. Not saying that the North was much better, but at the same time, where you could be killed in the South and your entire family wiped out. But migration also carried a cost, especially when it happens at the scale in which it did. When people move, they did not just leave land behind. They left networks. They left systems. They left money. They left trust. They left shared labor. They left family. They left systems of informal economic support. They left churches that helped them to grow their communities, that had helped communities to grow over time. And in many Southern communities, survival depended on these relationships, especially after slavery. They extended across family lines, community lines. They grew churches. They grew schools. They grew knowledge. They grew skills and resources that were shared in a way that allowed people to function collectively in an economic system that grew Black people. And they had to leave that. So when you think about it, which was more long-term value, a single job opportunity in a new place, or the network of people who you knew, you trusted, who you invested with, who you understood, and had helped you grow over time? And what happens when millions of people are separated from these sorts of networks and systems all at once and placed into environments that were not the same and had systems that didn't exist like that. This was not just movement. Again, as I said at the beginning, this was disruption of continuity. This was disruption of how to take Black wealth and move through time. When these migrants arrived in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, they were not entering open systems. They were entering environments that had already placed limitations on them. Housing was restricted. Employment opportunities were uneven. And access to capital was almost non-existent. And this is where policy in this country began to intersect with movement, because even as people were seeking opportunity, the structures of that opportunity were being shaped by decisions of racist and bigoted white people at the state, federal, and local levels. So you couldn't have a system that grew you because the entire government was pressuring you not to succeed. One of the most significant examples of that is redlining. We know that. We know in the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps. We have those maps that graded neighborhoods based on perceived investment risk. And as Blacks migrated to the north, they saw it as a risk. Areas where Black residents were frequently marked in red. They were labeled hazardous. They were labeled as unproductive. And once those labels were applied, they influenced lending. People couldn't get the same loans. People couldn't grow the same wealth. This affected behavioral patterns across the country. Banks became less likely to issue mortgages in those areas. Insurers were less likely to insure you in those areas. You had less investment in growing those communities in those areas. So we understand this created a cycle where lack of investment, lack of support led to deterioration. The ghettos didn't become the ghettos. They didn't become worn out and tore down because people were investing in it. No, that deterioration happened because they didn't put money into it, because they restricted. And once it was deteriorated, that justified even further lack of investment, of time, of putting money into those communities. Meanwhile, when the whites moved out to the suburbs, other communities, they received favorable ratings. They got loans. They got money put down on their homes to help them grow their wealth. And all these things were associated with the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration over recent years has come to admit what was being done at a federal level that choked off Black economic progress. So if we were to make that practical with two families with similar incomes, similar work ethics, and similar goods and similar goals and similar understandings, but one has access to loans, one has access to growth in the community, and the other does not, who's going to build wealth faster? One has a system working for them, and one has been denied a system. And if that difference continues for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, what does that turn into? What does that do to the minds of the people that are there? What does it do to the communities? And I want you to answer that honestly. Because when we talk about the gap in money, even to this day, we have to look at the effect of that, because that gap does not stay small. It compounds, it grows. This wasn't just a local issue. This was a federal issue. This was a city issue. This was reinforced through patterns, through zoning laws, housing placements, infrastructure decisions. This was something in cities like Chicago and New York. I'm from Chicago, that you can see even to this day. Black populations were often concentrated in specific areas. But whites could go open a business in that area. They could go put some money in an area, give you outdated food and stuff that doesn't do well for you, but they made money. This affected us not just socially, not economically, but the administrations affected our mentalities. Fiorello LaGuardia in New York after World War II, he expanded, him and others, like Robert Moses, they expanded public housing. But these developments were reinforced. They reinforced the concentration. They reinforced to us that they weren't going to disperse opportunities. They were going to keep us isolated. They would keep us concentrated. Their economic reach was to push us down. Because where you live affects where you can work. And when where you live and where you can work affects what you can build. And then once you can't build, it then affects how far your money can move from one generation to the next. So when we ask that question, is location just about geography, or is it one of the most important things that affected Black people economically? It was a major control system, because if you can control where people live, you can influence where they spend, where they work, and how far they can expand. And this is all documented in policy, in redlining. When we move into the period of urban renewal, officially, this was represented and presented as modernization and development. But in practice, urban renewal, many of these projects targeted areas where Black communities had already established some sort of economic presence. Neighborhoods were cleared to make way for highways. Robert Moses in New York did this. They cleared out homes to make highways, commercial developments, new construction that would be better for the city. In Detroit, the Black Bottom neighborhood was dismantled. In New York, areas like San Juan Hill were removed, wiped out. Businesses were displaced without compensating the people for what they took from them. And remember, I told you, they had to build them businesses without the same loans and functions given in the white systems. Residents were relocated, and once again, continuity was destroyed. Even if you tried to build, urban renewal was put in to stop you. Critics at the time called it really what it was. It was Negro removal, the precursor to gentrification, because the effect was clear. Development did not exist with Blacks. It only existed with whites. Development could not improve the existing communities. It had to replace them, remove them. And you got to think about it that way. And you have to function and make sure you understand it that way. If you build a community, establish business, finally create relationships again, and then that entire area is wiped out, cleared out, where does your wealth go? Does it move with the people who have been stripped of their ability to create wealth? Or does it stay tied in the land and the development that was stolen and rebuilt and repurposed? And if it does not move with the people, what are they left to rebuild from? They have to start all over again. They have to be disrupted all over again. So when you step back and look at these entire periods, the things I've gone over, right? We're not looking at isolated incidents. We're looking at a system. We're looking at disruption. We're looking at layers. We see destruction where wealth has been concentrated. We see migration that's disrupted existing Black wealth systems. We see federal policies that limited access to capital to disrupt those systems. We see local policies that control spaces and movement, and we see redevelopment that grew out of wiping out what was then what had been created by removing those communities altogether and taking that wealthy property. And I want you to think about that. If wealth is interrupted when it is built, interrupted when it moves, interrupted when it tries to grow, interrupted when it tries to stabilize, what kind of system does that create for the generations that come after? With all of that movement and disruption. And more importantly, when you look at the present, do you now see the results of what happened affect us today? Do you see the results of repeated interruption and how they affect us today? If you don't, you're not looking at history properly. You're not seeing it for what it actually is. We have to look at the isolation, the containment, and the fracturing that took place. Because, see, by the time we reach the point where we no longer are asking, rather disrupt, we're not going to ask, rather, did this happen? We're not at that point. We've reached that point. We know that it happened. We don't need you to verify because we got the history to show us. We've already established that. We've already recognized that. And too many people tell themselves, you see it online all the time, the lie, the mistruth, the misunderstanding that, oh no, this didn't happen. It happened. It happened. And it continues to happen. And I wanted to establish that with you tonight. As we talk about reparations, and when people say, well, slavery was a long time ago. No, you need to understand that this is real. Black financial generational wealth has been hindered, restricted. And now we have to examine what happens after repeated disruption becomes built into the American structure itself. Because once interruption is no longer occasional, as it was before in earlier times, coming out of slavery, before slavery, but now it's consistent. When you're consistently interrupted, disrupted, it begins to shape your environment, your thought process. It begins to make you see the difference in behavior, expectations, and even outcome. You don't see yourself as successful. You can't see yourself coming from a successful people. And this is where we move from moments of destruction into systems of containment. And this happened around in the 40s, and this happened in our major cities. As black populations became concentrated in these cities through migration and policy, a new spatial reality began to take form. A new behavior began to take form. These were not just neighborhoods that happened to be predominantly Black. They were areas where movement, investment, and expansion were limited in ways that were both visible and invisible. People understood living there that there were going to be housing restrictions, lending practices were going to be horrible, and zoning decisions could wipe out your whatever you did establish. And they all work together to create what we now refer to as the ghetto. When people say, I don't come from the ghetto. One of these famous rockers is talking about rap music being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it's the guy from Kiss. And he said, I'm not from the ghetto. Because they're not taught the history of the ghetto. And to a certain extent, neither are we. Neither are we. That word is often used without examining how it functioned economically. A ghetto is not simply a place of poverty. It is a place where economic activity is constrained and given boundaries and limits on how it can grow, while still allowing people to go work and to provide to the greater extracted reality. If you want an example of that, think about the Jews in Nazi Germany. This wasn't done under some just whim. People like Robert Moses, Fiorello LaGuardia, and other mayors throughout the country after World War II, they planned this. When we look at cities like Chicago and New York, Black residents were often restricted to specific districts. They built high rises and ghettos. And then they created formal policies and informal enforcement. They put police stations in the projects to keep you there. Restrictive covenants were put into place. Agreements for the uninformed. Documentation was put into court cases. If you look at court cases like the Shelley versus Kramer, that prevented Black families from purchasing homes in certain areas. Case law told people that this is where you're supposed to be. My son said he never heard Elvis's Christmas in the Ghetto. I did. But you would be surprised. Elvis himself in Mississippi grew up in what can be considered the ghetto. He did understand poverty. Even when you look at the ghetto and you see it for what it is, when you look at the economics of it, when you look at how it was created, it was done for nefarious purpose. Even after agreements were ruled unenforceable by law, right? Patterns of segregation, cultural practice still existed. There are parts of the city that you couldn't go to. You get your head cracked if you went to. People were present, but their ability to move beyond the areas where they were constrained was real. Now, consider what that does economically. If a population is concentrated in a limited geographic space, then the business that serve that population are also limited in their scope. Customer bases are restricted. Money inflow is reduced. Property values are suppressed. And without property value growth, there is not going to be much equity to leverage for further investments and for further growth. So the system did not simply contain people, it also contained opportunity. And anybody who grew up in the projects and in the ghetto can tell you that. And when you pause for a moment and you think about this carefully, if you cannot move freely into areas where properties grows, where business grows, and where capital and money can flow, what does that do to your long-term ability to create wealth? What does that also do to your psyche? I'm stuck here. I got to find some other way to bring in wealth. Does that mean I got to go pimp? Does that mean I got to go deal drugs? I got to do something because they're not investing in this area. And if that condition persists, not for just one generation, but for multiple generations, what begins to happen to the expectations of those that live in that confinement? I'm not making excuses for criminality. I'm telling you that it will affect your survival influence. It will make you think differently. Robert Moses, the father of transportation in New York. We have to look at that because when you layer transportation into the structure, in many urban centers, public transit systems were designed to limit your ability to grow wealth. Now, many of you are going to say, what? But it's true. It was designed to limit your ability to grow wealth, to limit your ability to move efficiently, but to move labor efficiently from residential areas to industrial or commercial centers. I could take a bus to go work at the factory. I could take a bus from the projects to go here. And the ghetto is not so far from here. It's right in line to where I need to go. Now, you may say, well, that's not inherently negative. I mean, I could spend a pennies on the dollar and I can go travel. But when access to private transportation is limited, because you can't buy a car, right, that will give you collateral because you don't have credit. You don't have capital. You have restricted lending. Mobility becomes dependent on these buses and these systems. And mobility in this context is not just about getting from one place to the other. It's not just about travel. It's about access to opportunity. If your movement is limited to predefined paths where you can go live and go to work, and then those workplaces aren't paying you enough for you to be able to get a vehicle. They're paying you basic minimum wage. I will not. I see you on here, John Morrison. And let me tell you something, because I want people to understand how stupid that this sounds. Name one thing Africans have built and designed the world needs or uses. Maybe you need to go back and watch the beginning of this episode and open up your mind and stop sounding foolish. I expect these sort of pushbacks. Everything I've told you tonight is factually based. And the reason why people comment like that is because you know it's factually based and it makes you mad. It angers you. It angers you to see that, to learn that. Movement, getting back to what I said, when it's limited, busing was designed to get you from work to home. Your ability to transit out of constrained conditions becomes significantly more difficult. You can't take buses to certain places, certain parts of the city you can't be, but you know this bus route, and now I get me a super transfer, or I get me a bus pass, and I can get on and go back and forth all day. But you don't see the constraint. And when you talk about mobility, are we only talking about physical movement, or are we also talking about economic movement? Because those two are connected. And when they are restricted, the other will follow. It's important because it's also related to collateral. It's also related to collateral, which is one of the most critical elements in wealth building in the United States, and always have built it. Collateral is what allows individuals and families to access credit, to start businesses, to invest, to expand. And in a lot of cases, that collateral becomes what you need for property ownership, for your home, for your house, for your business. When homeowners are limited through redlining and discriminatory lending, the ability to accumulate collateral is also limited. Without that collateral, access to loans becomes almost impossible. And without loans, you can't grow your economic activity. You can't grow your business, and you don't have the systems and the structures that we talked about earlier that were available in the South. And without that ability to scale or to grow, wealth remains stagnant. And if you do that for generations, if one generation is unable to acquire property at that scale, the next generation does not inherit any property, any wealth, or any collateral. They don't inherit anything that can grow them. And if that pattern continues for multiple generations, the gap between those who have access to collateral and those who do not grows wider and wider and wider. And why we can look at it and say why you start to see these ghettos. This is not simply about income. It's about assets. It's about assets that have been passed down. It's about the understanding and the knowledge that is not passed down. Because if you don't have assets, then you don't know how to grow those assets. You don't have the knowledge on how that's supposed to be done. And once that knowledge becomes interrupted, not lost, but interrupted, it's hard to get it back sometimes. You don't have the stability. If wealth in America is largely built about through assets, and access to those assets are restricted for Blacks over a long amount of time, what outcome would you expect to see? Let's not be emotional. Let's not be foolish like what some people in here said. Let's be logical. What would the numbers look like after 50, 60, 70 years? What would they look at after 100 years? Go look back to 1926 and look at where we are now in 2026. And if we were, let's add another layer. And that's where the conversation does become a little bit more complex, and for a lot of people becomes uncomfortable, because beyond spatial and economic restrictions, there are social and structural pressures that affect how we pass knowledge within families and communities. The 20th century brought significant changes in our families through the military. When you look at how many Blacks were shipped out during the Vietnam era, Black men were drafted disproportionately. When we look at people being locked up for minor offenses, like smoking weed, you start to diminish a society. People say, well, service itself is not bad. No, service is not the issue. The issue is the cumulative effect of removal, of taking Black males and removing them out of the ghetto and not allowing them to grow families, especially combined with all of the other disruptions. And as we look through the 20th century and we saw the rise of drugs and everything in the ghettos, right? The drug epidemics that had a profound effect and impacted the community. People say, oh, well, why were they so addicted to drugs? Because it's escapism. You are restricting, constrained, imprisoning. When we look at heroin in the 1960s, 50s, and the 60s, when we look at crack cocaine in the 80s, and it contributed to a cycle of addiction, incarceration, and instability. Scholars from all over talk about it, but nobody looks at the system that opened the door for it. Nobody looks at what led to it. Increased incarceration rates, particularly under policies, well, what they call the war on drugs, removed so many Black people from their communities, which were already impoverished. And it further disrupted the families, the structures, and the ability to grow economically. And when you step back and look at how these layers, everything we talked about, how they interact, spatial restriction limits, the ability to have collateral limits, all of this, economic restrictions that don't allow you to have capital and growth, transportation limitations that we didn't even see as a limitation. We thought, oh, I'll just take the bus. Now you don't have a car. You have no collateral. You don't have the ability to borrow against anything. But it also restricts your mobility and your opportunity. Lack of collateral that restricts your expansion, and social disruptions, again, rather through war, incarceration, through drugs, all it affected us. So I want you to think about this more effectively, more robustly, and more carefully. And I want you to answer to yourself when you ask questions about this. Did all of these factors have a purpose? Did all of them affect us? Did it weaken us? If you can't see the truth of that, then you'll be caught in the lies of foolish people who, like the person that came on here. Because see, these distinctions matter. It's not just one explanation. It's a whole lot of things. Here's another question I want you to consider before we move forward. If a community is placed in an environment where movement is limited, capital is limited, assets are taken, and continuity is disrupted across generations, what kind of economic knowledge, behavior, understanding, what do you expect to emerge? What do you expect to retain? And then are you surprised at the present conditions when you say, oh, these kids ain't no good? Do these behaviors reflect choices alone? Is it just choice, or do they reflect adaptation to the structures that were put in place to limit people? Be honest with that. Because so many people aren't. And they lie about it. I know this episode seems a little long, but it's because I want you to understand. I really want you to get a really good understanding. So when you watch this later, or you look at it later, you can understand, and you can pass it and share it with others who may only talk about some parts of it. But I'm trying to give you a full layout from ancient Africa all the way to present day reality, and how adaptation and rebuilding, all of that has affected us over time. Because see, here's the thing. We are dealing with an accumulation of outcomes, with an accumulation of disruptions. Everything that we've discussed tonight, structure, disruption, policy, containment, and generational interruption, it doesn't just stay in the past. It carries forward. It touches all of us, even us, every one of us, white, black, or whatever, to this day. It shows up in the violence in our neighborhood. It shows up in the data that people poll. It shows up in behavior. It shows up in expectations. It shows up in schooling. It shows up everywhere. So when we talk about the present, we're not talking about a fresh starting point. We're talking about a place that has been shaped in this country over time. And only a moronic person who doesn't want to look at reality or facts would tell you that it doesn't exist. I just laid it out to you over the last hour. If we look at wealth in the United States today, one of the clearest indicators of long-term economic stability is net worth, not income. Not income. Assets. What is owned? What did your family leave to you? If your grandparents were farmers and had land, and they left that land to you, what is that land worth? If your land, your family had land in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and then they had to leave during the migration, and it was taken from them. That's wealth. That's assets. What can be leveraged and what can be passed on? Data shows it. So we ain't got to lie about it. Data from institutions like the Federal Reserve consistently show a significant gap in the median household wealth between blacks and white families. That gap is not explained by a single factor. We just went over a lot of the factors. What it does is it reflects the difference in home ownership, access to capital, inheritance, and long-term investment opportunities that aren't given to these families that was constantly disrupted, stolen, and taken. And when you pause and you think about that carefully, if wealth that has been built over generations is in one group has had consistent opportunity, right, to grow its property, to pass down its farmland, to grow credit, and to pass down inheritance, while another group has experienced repeated interruption and disruption. And at each of these stages, there's been violence and there's been turmoil. What would you expect the outcome to look like today after 3 or 4 or 5 generations? I don't care about what you feel. What would you expect as a logical thinking individual based on the facts and everything that we've discussed tonight? Because when you look at home ownership, when you look at how people gain their wealth, because home ownership is still one of the primary ways families build equity in this country, and they pass it on. They pass it on. I stress the idea of the farms. I stress the ideas because everybody's like reparations, and I'm not against that. But what I'm telling you is we have a whole country built off of people who have stolen land, folks who have migrated, people who, if they went to look back in records, their families had deeds on this land that they had to leave because people violently attacked them. Places where people have built hotels, places where people have built huge home layouts and all of these structures. While people are still, the folks who own the land originally are living in ghettos. They don't have anything to pass down from one generation to the next. And then we wonder why Black home ownership rates remain significantly lower than those of whites who inherit, sometimes majority of them inherit homes from grandpa, from mom and dad, and sometimes multiple homes. Because the ability to build that wealth, and then you got people sit there and tell you, you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. You got morons like the person that was on here who will sit there and tell you, well, what did Black people ever build? And they act like they don't understand the theft and the killing and the murder, that they don't get it. Why people marched and cried and prayed and begged and did everything that they could to try to keep what they owned. And why they sound ignorant. But in the society today, we continue to see it. It's important. Without that asset, families are not likely to rely, right, on anything other than the income that they bring in. And income by itself is not designed. Let me say that so you don't hear it in the back. Income itself, this is why I tell my sons, itself is not designed by itself to build long-term wealth. You have to buy a house. You have to buy a car. You have to invest. If one family is able to purchase a home, build equity, and pass that asset down, and another family is renting across generations, riding the bus across generations, they have no collateral, they have no assets to transfer. How far apart do these families become after 20 years? after the lifespan of a child growing up in that home, after 50 years, when that child has kids. And see, once that gap exists, how far apart does it grow, and how difficult is it to close without access to the same tools that some people got in the beginning? Because see, we have to look at that. And if we move beyond assets and into behavior, because behavior does not develop in isolation. Let me say that again. This is a psychological fact. Behavior does not develop in isolation. It develops in response to an environment, to the system, to wealth and health and knowledge. When access to ownership is limited, consumption often becomes the more immediate form of economic participation. You are a consumer, right? Money comes in and it goes out. Money comes in and it goes out. But it does not stay long enough for you to be able to multiply it. And see, that's not a simple matter of individual choice. It's a reflection of inheritance. It's a reflection of limited access to opportunities that would have allowed money to circulate differently. So when we ask that question of how did people get there, when we pretend that these things didn't happen in this country, when you hear conversations about spending versus ownership, saving, right? And people are talking about consumption. Do you think these behaviors exist in a vacuum? Or do you think they were shaped by people who have historically had access and have been denied access? Because if you remove access to ownership for long enough, what becomes normal begins to shift. Having an apartment and not a home becomes the norm. Riding a bus and not getting a car becomes the norm. And we have to be honest, because it's easy to remain in an analysis mode and never move into responsibility. History explains conditions, but it does not remove agency. It does not remove how we think. That's why I'm teaching this tonight. History gives context. It raises a question about what can be done to change this. Because here's the reality. Despite everything that we've discussed tonight, destruction, policy, restriction, and disruption, Black people today, still today, we see it in Black dollars, still represent significant economic presence. We have money, but we don't have wealth. Estimates show that Black consumer spending power have reached into the trillions annually. We buy a lot. That means our money is moving, but it's moving in the wrong place. It's moving in the wrong way. And the question is how do we make it move more positively? And how do we make it positioned to build and to grow and to circulate outwardly to help us and those in our family and those in our community? And we have to have that conversation that is often avoided because it requires a shift from us just analyzing, explaining, to action. We got to go back to the beginning. Because see, if we built systems before, I've already showed you all of them. We built them under different conditions. That ability to build hasn't disappeared. What has changed is the environment in which that building must take place. What has changed is how we think about that building and how we protect ourselves to not be disrupted again. And it means that our building has to be intentional. Rebuilding doesn't begin with large-scale change. It begins with patterns. It begins in our churches. It begins in our homes. It begins with our relationships. It begins with how money is viewed, how it is used. And I'm talking to you as someone who has to live that just like you. How it is protected. It involves understanding ownership, not just a concept, but as a practice. Why it's important for you to save up that money to go get a car. Why it's important for you to try to get a home. Why it's important for you to try to get out of that apartment. Why it's important for you to try to grow generational wealth. Ownership of property, ownership of business, ownership of skills. Grow your knowledge, your education in trade, in college. Grow your ability to understand so you can leverage it over time. Don't tell people they shouldn't go to school. Don't tell people they shouldn't gain outside knowledge. It requires us to look at our collective behavior. Earlier, we discussed how wealth systems in Africa and societies in early Black American communities involved shared responsibility and shared benefit and shared growth. What does that mean? We ain't got to go backward. That's not what we're not looking backward to just go back. We're looking back there to learn so we can understand that this is not just about an individual progress, but a collective progress. And that those two things don't have to be separate. Churches who talk about investing, churches who talk about how to grow, churches who teach you how to grow your investments. Communities, families who talk about that, just like our ancestors did. Because if I ask you, and I want you to be honest, not just in the chat, but if you don't put it in the chat, even to yourself, when you think about rebuilding economic strength, what do you think has to come first? Is it ownership? Is it education? Is it the discipline to do it? Or do you think it's something else entirely? Because whatever your answer is, that's where you should be starting right now to build you and your family. Because see, if access to capital has been historically has been limited, think like our ancestors. What are the alternative ways to create capital today? When Black Wall Street burned down, they had to find other ways to rebuild. What skills, what networks, what digital platforms, what entrepreneurship, what do you have within your environment, within your scope of influence that can grow you? See, those are not replacements. That's structural change. They're tools that will allow you to change your current environment. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you use them? How do you use them? I know I've been on here for a while. Rebuilding is not about ignoring history. I'm sure our ancestors who were disrupted knew that other disruptions had happened, but they didn't stop. They didn't stop. We have to understand our history, because once we understand it clearly enough, we can move differently into our present. We can make different decisions. We can stop arguing with moronic people who tell us that there's no reason for you to be you Black folks shouldn't be complaining. Once you have a better understanding of how we got here, it wasn't all our fault, but we're not placing blame. We're trying to move forward with the knowledge so that we can move differently into the present. That simply requires awareness, factual awareness. And then it requires us to change our mindset and then to remain consistent. I want you, when you go back and look at this episode, I want you to step back, go back over the sections if you need to, the different eras that I talked about. Think about everything we covered tonight. We started with a structured economic system in Africa, how our ancestors ran economies. We moved through Reconstruction. We moved the destruction of Black communities. We moved through the Great Black Migration. We moved through policy. We talked about containment. We talked about the generational impacts of all of that. And that brings us to where we are right now. And we can now look at those layers and make a plan and learn from that history and see how all those layers combined so that we know how to go beyond them. The question is, and I want you to think about this, one of my final questions. If you understand how wealth was built, how it was interrupted, and how these interruptions and disruptions shaped where we are today, then what does the rebuilding of our generational wealth, what does it require? What will it require of us? Not in theory, but in practice. What changes at the individual and community level will begin to shift our outcomes over time? It took generations to get here, but what will shift our outcomes over time? What will make us think differently over time? What will educate us better over time? And more importantly, are we willing to make these changes consistently enough for them to matter? That is the issue. Are we willing to do it consistently? Because I think a lot of us would like to do it, but can we be consistent? Can we be consistent? This has been a great episode. Tonight, it wasn't about placing blame. It wasn't about trying to create a division. It just required us to examine things fully, to have some clarity and some facts, to anger some racists, some bigots, enough to respond and say something silly. Now, we're not placing blame. It's not really what this is about. And we're not creating excuses. It's about understanding where we come from so that we don't always see ourselves as failed. Because see, once we understand the structures and the geniuses that we came from, we can begin to see that change is possible, that growth is possible. And we do. We see it in some parts of our society. And then when we get to see where effort it needs to be applied. I know what we discussed tonight ain't simple, and it ain't meant to be, but it is necessary. Because if we don't understand how something was built and how we got here, then you can't talk to me about finance and then saying, well, everybody shouldn't be at this level. That's right. But why are we? Let's be honest with that. Because the other cultures who have been repressed and disrupted, they got reparations. They got reparations. They were allowed to request and to rebuild. The Native Americans who own casinos, land, right? The Jewish people who weren't even oppressed per se by America, who were given monies and property and financial help. They got these things. So it is important to understand your history and where you come from. Before I leave tonight, I want to leave you with something practical, because I'm trying to get some new things out. Because see, one of the things I've learned over time is information by itself is not enough. You can listen to a discussion like what we just had. You can take in the history and you can even agree with everything that I said. But if there is no structure to continue learning, most of it fades over time. And one of the biggest gaps I've seen, especially when it comes to Black history, is not just misinformation and disinformation. Those are huge. It's incomplete exposure. People are introduced to fragments, moments, and isolated figures, but they are rarely guided through the full scope and analytical understanding of civilizations, systems, contributions, and how these things have existed across time. It's one of the reasons why my last book that you can get on Amazon, the Erudition Network presents 101 Black History and Question Challenge, Early World. Go get the digital copy that you can load on your phone and load in your ebooks. It's not a traditional history book. It's designed differently on purpose. And it covers some of the things I covered earlier in Africa. It's built as a question-based experience. It's not the Black AF history and the other books that are out here. No, it's question-based. And it takes you to ancient civilization and it forces you to engage with the material instead of just reading it. It should be selling better. It should be in your home because it should be used as your game nights. Because when you're answering questions, when you're thinking through connections, like some of the things we covered tonight, when you're challenged to recall and apply what you've learned, that information stays with you. It registers in a different way. That book, go on Amazon tonight, go get it. Takes you across a range of civilizations that are often not mentioned, that aren't covered a lot of times in our history books at all, that aren't discussed in mainstream discussions, not on TikTok with the people who are giving out this information. It covers early development. It covers the ties that of the origins of humanity. It talks about Elam, the kingdom of Saba, the Indus Valley civilization, Carthage, Numidia, Mesopotamia, the kingdoms of Kush, Egypt, the Exum Empire, and even the African Phoenicians. And if any of those things don't sound like things you know, you need to go get that book. And the goal is not just to name or know these places, but to understand what they contributed so you can start to layer your history like we did tonight. How they function and how they connect to you on the broader narrative of Black history. I put images in their book that are thought-provoking to the questions. And there is a structure that allows you to test what you know over and over and over and over again. And so since this is an interactive and I like to ask questions, after everything we've talked about tonight, after looking at the systems, the disruption, and the importance of understanding history fully, how do you continue learning on your own? Because if the only time you engage in this information is doing a live session like this or listening to somebody like talk, then you're depending on moments instead of building a foundation. And I want you to build a foundation with Erudition. The books we put out, this one in particular, and the other ones that are to come, are designed to help you build that foundation. Stop sitting on it. Stop ignoring it. Stop being passive. Be active. It's not about memorizing. It's about thinking. And I know you will grow from it. I know you will grow from it. Ask yourself, what is one area in history that you realize tonight, of anything I covered in this hour and a half, that you didn't fully understand before? Put it in our remarks. Put it in Facebook. Put it in YouTube. Be honest with yourself. Because see, that's where learning starts. That's where we grow. That's what this network is about. Tonight, I wasn't trying to give you all of the answers. It was about giving you the right questions, the right thoughts, and the things to help you push yourself to learn. Because history is not about something you just listen to. It's to push you to examine, something for you to challenge, and something to build upon over time. That's what it's about. Think about it analytically. We started by establishing that Black economic power did not begin in struggle. It didn't begin after slavery. We walked through all the systems that were built. We walked through how they were interrupted, how they were disrupted, and how these interruptions shaped what we see today. That's the importance of history. That's why you need to look at it that way. After this episode, you should be left with a choice. After going to get my book, you should be left with a choice. You can take only what you heard and leave it here, or you can continue to build on it. Join us on our programs. Join us in our interactive. Even if you don't always agree. Because see, here's the thing. Understanding history is not just about focusing on the past. I am a strategic historian, public historian. It's about recognizing patterns so you can move differently in the present. Let me say that again. It's about recognizing the patterns so you can make better decisions and move differently in the present. Do me that favor. Go spend that $18, not $20, not the $30 that some of these history books are asking about. Go out there and get that digital copy. Put it on your phone. You know, that Apple phone that you got, that you can sit there and scroll through it on the train or in your car when you're sitting there having lunch. Go learn and grow your history. I appreciate your time, your attention, and all of you who are willing to engage either later on. I appreciate all of you who support. You can support Erudition financially. You see our ticker. Our Cash App is on here. You can go on YouTube and you will see our shorts, and they share our other different ways of donating and helping the program as we build new programs. This is the Erudition Network. This is what it looks like when we grow knowledge and understanding on purpose and with reason. I hope to see you guys next week. I hope that you got something from tonight. I thank you. A lot of y'all were quiet tonight, but I hope you got something. If you can't financially support, share this episode. Share the shorts that you will see on this episode. Encourage people to join and subscribe to our YouTube channel, to our Facebook communities, to our school communities, SKOOL. Do those things so you can grow with us. Make recommendations of things you want us to cover. All right. I said enough. You all be blessed. I thank you again for your time. There will be another advertisement for my book at the end of this, but you all be blessed. I thank you. Have a great night and a great rest of your weekend. Thank you.
From Eddie K. Phillips, founder of the Erudition Network, comes 101 Black History Questions, a groundbreaking book that challenges what you thought you knew and uncovers the stories history tried to hide. Perfect for classrooms, families, and curious minds. Get the digital copy today on Amazon.